All right, I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Purnima Qamar, who is a psychology major and will present on a talk that will answer, do parental negative emotions moderate the link between child empathy and anxiety in Latina girls? Right,
Hello,
go ahead.
oh, I just want to confirm you're able to see my screen fully. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So welcome everyone. My name is Purnima Qamar, and today I'll be presenting our research on the question, do parental negative emotions moderate the link between child empathy and anxiety in Latina girls? So feelings of others are what we humans are constantly surrounded by. You have all probably experienced a time where a friend or family member was upset and came to you for support or for advice. Often, in order to be supportive, you need to be able to put yourself in their shoes. And this concept is called empathy, a skill known as the ability to perceive, understand, and resonate with the emotions of others. And it is an important skill for us to foster healthy relationships. However, empathy might not always be associated with positive outcomes. Some children display over empathy, meaning they have excessive emotional responses to other people's distress. Studies have found that children who display over-empathic responses are also at an increased risk for developing internalizing disorders like anxiety and depression. Some children may be especially vulnerable to the negative effects of over-empathy. Examples of this would be children who have a tendency to become physiologically hyper-aroused. These children tend to display a fight or flight response to mild stressors, meaning they display an accelerated heart rate, sweating, and a shortness of breath. And this elevated physiological response might predispose them to having overly emotional responses to others' distress. The relationship between anxiety, depression, and empathy might also be influenced by environmental variables, such as parenting. Children with parents who display more negative emotions are more likely to develop negative health outcomes like anxiety, depression, and self-doubt. Furthermore, long-term exposure to parents' negative emotions may cause children to develop problematic empathic responses. Neuroticism is one measure of negative emotionality. It is the tendency to feel negative emotions, including anxiety, depression, and self-doubt. Therefore, children with parents who are high in neuroticism might influence the link between over-empathy and internalizing disorders. In our study, we tested two primary aims. In a sample of 59 Latina girls between the ages of 8 and 12 years old, we first tested whether childhood affective empathy was associated with internalizing disorders. Specifically, we focused on anxiety and depression. Our second objective was to see if this relationship was moderated by parent neuroticism. Essentially, we tested whether parent neuroticism influenced the relationship between child empathy and its relationships with anxiety and depression. And to do this, we ran two different models. One tested the relationship between parental neuroticism, child empathy, and child anxiety, as you can see on the left, and the other tested the relationship between parental neuroticism, child empathy, and child depression, as you can see on the right. The age range for our study was 8 to 12 years old, and it was selected because internalizing disorders begin to onset during middle childhood. And compared to boys, girls are at an especially high risk of developing internalizing disorders, and they show stronger empathic responses. This makes them a high-risk group for displaying over-empathy. Latina youth might also be at a high risk of internalizing disorders. However, most available research on childhood empathy and internalizing disorders focuses primarily on white children, despite the large Latinx population in the United States. So more research is needed to examine these constructs in underrepresented populations. We hypothesized that one, elevated affective empathy in children would be positively associated with depression and anxiety. This means that children with high levels of empathy would also show high levels of anxiety, as seen in our anxiety model, and depression, as seen in our depression model. And two, we hypothesized that children of parents who are high in neuroticism would display a stronger link between empathy and depression and anxiety. In our analyses, we did not find any significant effects in the anxiety models. For our time today, I'm going to be focusing on presenting the results of the depression model. We collected information about all of the variables in this study through self-report questionnaires. Our dependent variable was children's depressive symptoms. Children self-reported on their own depressive symptoms on the child's depression inventory. And this is a 27-item questionnaire that measures children's negative mood, physical symptoms, and negative self-esteem. Our independent variable was children's empathy. We measured children's empathy via a self-report scale on the affective empathy subscale of the empathy questionnaire for children and adolescents. Specifically, we focused on affective empathy, which is related to the sensations and feelings children experience in response to others' emotions. So we hypothesized that the subscale would only be most likely to capture children's over-empathy. We also tested how the relationship between child depression and empathy was moderated by parental neuroticism. And neuroticism was measured via self-report on the neuroticism subscale of the Big Five inventory, which is a personality assessment. Finally, we included children's physiological arousal as a covariate in this model. This was important to consider as prior research suggests that the tendency to become physiologically hyperaroused, once again, such as an accelerated heart rate, sweating, and a shortness of breath, may be related to children's internalizing symptoms, as well as their tendency to become overly distressed. In terms of our results, what we first observed is that physiological arousal was positively associated with children's depressive symptoms. This means that children who reported elevated physiological fight or flight responses also had more depressive symptoms. This was consistent with existing literature that physiological arousal is positively correlated with internalizing symptoms. Next, we found a main effect of affective empathy. In line with our first hypothesis, children's affective empathy was positively correlated with depressive symptoms. This means that children who reported greater levels of affective empathy also had elevated depressive symptoms, suggesting that elevated empathy may be a risk factor for depression. We also found a main effect of parental neuroticism. Children whose parents were more neurotic also had elevated symptoms of depression. Again, this is consistent with prior literature finding that parental negative emotionality is associated with children's depression. And lastly, we observed a significant interaction between child empathy and parent negative emotionality, which we'll now dive deeper into. In order to break down this interaction, we performed a simple slopes analysis. And this analysis is plotted on the graph. We have parent neuroticism on the x-axis and child depression on the y-axis. And the three lines represent children with low, moderate, and high levels of empathy. Low empathy was defined as 1 standard deviation below the mean, moderate empathy was defined as the mean levels of empathy, and high empathy was defined as 1 standard deviation above the mean. We found that children with low and moderate empathy, portrayed in the blue and red lines here, have positively associated parental neuroticism with child depressive symptoms. And this association was strongest for children with low levels of empathy. Additionally, we found that for children with high levels of empathy, seen as the green line here, parental neuroticism was not associated with depression. This was contrary to our second hypothesis, as we expected children with high levels of affective empathy whose parents were highly neurotic to display the highest levels of depression. What we found instead is that parental neuroticism is only related to depression for children with moderate or low levels of empathy. And this data suggests that even though too much empathy is associated with increased levels of depression, empathy might also be a protective factor against the negative effects of parental neuroticism. In sum, our findings examine the interactive association between child empathy and parental neuroticism on child depression, controlling for children's physiological symptoms. And we found several interesting effects. First, we found that children's depressive symptoms were predicted by their physiological arousal. Second, we observed that depressive symptoms were predicted by parental neuroticism. These findings support prevalent literature, such as there exists a relationship between children's physiological arousal and the increased risk for internalizing disorders such as depression. Additionally, such developmental literature has typically been the product of primarily white families from high socioeconomic statuses. Thus, these findings broaden the scope of such literature to represent people of color and the Latinx population. Our third finding was that children's affective empathy was positively correlated with depressive symptoms. This supports our hypothesis and suggests that excessive empathy can be a risk factor for developing depression. However, because all of our data was collected at one period of time, we are unable to determine the direction of this association, meaning that it is possible that children with elevated depression are more empathic, but that over-empathy might not be leading to elevated depression. Further research should emphasize this relationship longitudinally to test whether effective empathy predicts future depressive symptoms. Finally, we found that despite the fact that empathy predicted depression, high empathy seems to be a buffer against the negative effects of parental neuroticism. While this was the opposite of our hypothesis, it opens the door to future research in the protective factors of empathy in developmental psychology and literature. To finish, I would like to thank you for your time and attention. Additionally, I would like to give a tremendous thanks to Dana Glenn, Dr. Mihalska, and the KIND Lab at UCR for their support and guidance throughout this project. I've also attached my email to the slide if you have any questions after our Q&A session today. Thank you.
Thank you.